Imagine waking up before dawn, not in the comfort of your own bed, but on a rough straw mat in a cold stone barracks. The air is sharp, the room is dim, and before you even stretch your arms, the sound of a horn reminds you of your duty. You are a Spartan warrior, raised to fight, trained to endure, and expected to survive. For most of us today, the thought of living as a Spartan, even for a single day, is almost impossible. Their lives were built around discipline, sacrifice, and hardship. From the brutal training of youth, to the relentless expectations of adulthood, to the unwavering demand for loyalty to the state, Sparta was a world where weakness was never tolerated. Tonight, we'll step into that world. We'll explore what daily life was truly like for a Spartan warrior, and why so few of us could ever last more than a moment in their shoes. Along the way, we'll wander through other histories, too strange, fascinating stories that remind us of how different life once was. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps our little community grow, and it lets you find your way back whenever you need a calm voice to drift off to. In the comments, I'd love to know what parts of history you're most curious about, and when and where you usually listen in, whether it's at night before bed, during a nap, or just when your mind needs a quiet place to rest. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let's begin the journey into Sparta, where the life of a warrior might keep you awake. But here, it's meant to gently guide you into sleep. Chapter 1. Born into Sparta. To understand why you wouldn't last a day as a Spartan warrior, we need to begin at the very first breath of life. In ancient Sparta, even birth itself was a test of strength, and survival was never guaranteed. For most of us today, the moment of birth is met with celebration, warmth, and the immediate embrace of family. In Sparta, however, the arrival of a new life was first met with judgment. A newborn child in Sparta did not belong solely to its parents. It belonged, in a sense, to the state. Spartan society valued above all else the strength of its warriors, and from the earliest moment of life, every child was weighed against that standard. Soon after birth, an infant was brought before the elders of the tribe. These were older men who had lived long enough to see generations of warriors pass through Sparta's harsh system, and they held the power of decision over whether a child would be allowed to live or not. They did not look for beauty. They did not look for charm. What mattered was health, strength, and the potential for endurance. If the baby appeared robust and healthy, the family would be allowed to raise it. But if the child was considered weak, frail, or malformed, the elders made a cruel judgment. The infant might be left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, a grim reminder of how little room there was for weakness in a society built on war. It is a practice that shocks us today, yet for Spartans, it was a practical necessity. They believed that the survival of their community depended on weeding out weakness before it could grow. Each warrior needed to be perfect, because every soldier in the Spartan phalanx depended on the strength of the man beside him. To falter in battle meant not just one man's death, but the collapse of the formation, the endangerment of the unit, and perhaps even defeat for Sparta itself. For the families of Sparta, this custom meant living with a constant awareness that their children were never entirely their own. The state had the first say, and the state always looked through the eyes of war. Imagine the heavy silence as parents presented their newborn, waiting for the elder's verdict. A sigh of relief if the child was accepted. A crushing grief if it was not. Yet grief was not to be shown openly. Spartans valued self-control, even in mourning. If a child was spared, life ahead was still not gentle. The early years were a time to grow under the watchful eyes of mothers. But even then, Spartan parenting was far different from what most of us would know. Mothers themselves had been raised in a world that demanded strength. They believed in cold baths, plain food, and early training and discipline. A Spartan child did not grow up with soft blankets and indulgent toys, but with the expectation that comfort was fleeting and strength was permanent. The cradle was not always a place of stillness. Spartan parents were said to shake the crib, to rock it roughly, so the child would learn not to cry from fear. Fear, after all, was an enemy that must be mastered from the very beginning. Spartan mothers sang lullabies, not of sweetness and dreams, but of glory, battle, and honor. The songs of childhood carried the same themes that would define adulthood: loyalty to Sparta, courage in war, and endurance of pain. Even the very names given to children reflected strength and simplicity. Spartan names were short and sharp, like the commands of a general or the cry of a warrior. A name was meant to fit in a war camp, shouted across a battlefield, or etched into a story of victory. Everything was functional, direct, and stripped of excess. As boys and girls grew in those early years, their worlds were different from the rest of Greece. In Athens, for example, children were taught music, art, and philosophy. In Sparta, children were taught resilience. They ran barefoot, often over rough ground, so their feet would harden. They ate plain food, so they would not grow dependent on flavor or variety. They were discouraged from crying, so they would learn to face pain in silence. Even play was a kind of preparation for battle, with games that mirrored the struggles of war. And yet, not all of childhood was without affection. Spartan mothers were known for their sharp tongues, but also for their deep pride. They were fierce women who carried themselves with dignity and who expected their children to honor the legacy of Sparta. They often told their sons, "Return with your shield or on it." It was not cruelty, but a reminder that honor mattered more than life. In their eyes, the greatest gift a mother could give Sparta was a son who died bravely. Girls, too, were shaped by these early years. Unlike most Greek city-states, Sparta allowed girls to receive physical training. They ran, they wrestled, and they learned to be strong, because the Spartans believed that strong mothers gave birth to strong sons. While boys were prepared for war, girls were prepared to raise warriors and to carry the pride of Sparta in their own way. So from the very beginning, every aspect of life bent toward the same goal: endurance, discipline, and service to the state. Childhood in Sparta was not a time of carefree play, but a long introduction to the demands of adulthood. For us today, it is difficult to imagine growing up in such a world. Yet for Spartans, it was the only world they knew. Think for a moment about your own childhood. The laughter, the warmth, the small comforts that made you feel safe. Now imagine those replaced with tests, judgments, and unrelenting preparation for a life of hardship. Imagine that every word spoken to you was meant to harden your spirit. Every meal was meant to sharpen your endurance, and every game was meant to train your body. This was the cradle of Sparta, the forge in which warriors were shaped, not as individuals, but as pieces of a greater whole. It is no wonder, then, that most of us would not last a day as a Spartan warrior. For them, a single day of endurance rested upon years of preparation, years of lessons etched into the body and the mind. The moment of birth was only the beginning. The long path ahead was harsh, unforgiving, and inescapable. And so, with this foundation laid, the story of Sparta begins not with men already in armor, but with children growing up under the weight of expectations far greater than themselves. Chapter 2. Childhood in the Agoge. If birth in Sparta was a test, then childhood was the beginning of the real trial. For most children, growing up means years of parental care, gentle guidance, and play. In Sparta, childhood was brief, almost fleeting, because at the age of 7, boys were taken from their homes and sent into the agoge, the state-run training system that would shape them into warriors. It was not a choice. It was not something that parents could deny. The agoge was the heart of Sparta, and every boy destined for the army had to pass through it. Imagine being 7 years old, just old enough to cling to your mother's hand, and suddenly being told that you could not sleep in your family's house anymore. The warmth of home, the comfort of familiar meals, the presence of your father and siblings. All of that was left behind. Instead, you were marched into a barracks, placed among strangers, and told that these boys would now be your brothers. The agoge was not just a school. It was a forge. Its purpose was to burn away softness and weakness until only strength remained. The first lessons were in obedience. Spartan boys were taught to listen before they spoke, to act before they complained. Silence was valued. Discipline was everything. A child who resisted too loudly would be met with punishment, but punishment itself was not seen as cruelty. It was a tool, a reminder that endurance mattered more than comfort. Each hardship was a lesson, each bruise a reminder of what survival required. Daily life in the agoge was harsh. Boys were given one cloak to wear year-round, in the heat of summer and the chill of winter. They slept together on beds of reeds, which they had to collect themselves. If the reeds cut their skin, it was considered a useful lesson in toughness. Meals were plain and often scarce, designed to keep them hungry rather than satisfied. Hunger, after all, was part of the training. It kept them sharp, alert, and ready to seize opportunity. Stealing food was expected. A boy who managed to sneak extra rations without being caught was praised for his cunning. But if he was caught, the punishment was harsh, not because he had stolen, but because he had failed. The lesson was clear. Survival required both boldness and intelligence. Every act of daily life was a chance to prove oneself, and failure was never overlooked. Training exercises filled much of the day. Boys ran long distances, wrestled, boxed, and fought mock battles with wooden weapons. Their bodies were hardened through repetition, their spirits tested by exhaustion. Bruises, cuts, and even broken bones were not unusual. Pain was not considered a setback. It was part of the education. To endure without complaint was the true mark of a Spartan. And yet, the agoge was not just about physical strength. Boys were taught to read and write, but only enough to serve military needs. More important were lessons in cunning, quick thinking, and clever speech. Spartans valued brevity, and their sharp, laconic way of speaking was legendary throughout Greece. A boy who could deliver a clever answer in as few words as possible was admired as much as one who could throw a spear. Life in the agoge was also about loyalty. Boys learned to see their companions as brothers, bound by shared hardship. Bonds of family were slowly replaced by bonds of comradeship. The state wanted its soldiers to fight not for individual pride, but for the unit, for the phalanx, for Sparta itself. Personal desires faded into the background. The agoge stripped away individuality and replaced it with unity. Punishments were severe. Whippings were common, sometimes even given in public to test endurance. One of the most famous stories tells of a boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When he was caught, he refused to reveal the animal, even as it clawed and bit into his flesh. He endured the pain in silence, proving that he could suffer without complaint. Though the story may be exaggerated, it captures the spirit of the agoge: silence, endurance, and strength above all else. At times, the training blurred the line between education and cruelty. But for the Spartans, cruelty was not the goal. The goal was survival. Each hardship was a rehearsal for the battlefield. If a boy could sleep cold, hungry, and sore, then he would be prepared for the long march of war. If he could endure pain without flinching, then he would be steady when the enemy's weapons struck. The agoge also trained boys in music and dance, but even these had a military edge. Songs were sung to build rhythm in marching, to unify voices, to celebrate valor. Dance was not for entertainment, but for agility, coordination, and preparation for combat. Every part of the program circled back to the same purpose: to create perfect warriors. As the years passed, boys advanced through different stages of the agoge. Older boys mentored younger ones, teaching them discipline through both guidance and force. Rivalries developed, but so did deep bonds. Friendships were forged in hardship, and these bonds would later form the foundation of the Spartan phalanx, where trust in the man beside you was the difference between life and death. The state's control extended beyond the training grounds. Even visits with family were limited, and the influence of parents faded as the agoge reshaped the child. A Spartan boy's true family became the state, his true home the barracks, his true purpose the battlefield. To modern eyes, this may seem unbearably harsh, but for Spartans it was the highest honor. A boy who excelled in the agoge earned respect. A boy who faltered faced shame. There was little room for failure, because every Spartan warrior had to be capable of holding the line. The agoge did not just create soldiers, it created the backbone of Sparta itself. Imagine yourself at 7 years old, stripped of family comforts, handed a cloak, a reed bed, and a plain meal. Imagine being told to fight for your food, to sleep in the cold, to endure pain without a sound. Most of us would break within days, perhaps even hours. Yet for a Spartan boy, this was life, and survival meant pride. By the time they emerged from the agoge as young men, Spartans were no longer children of their parents. They were children of Sparta, molded by fire, hunger, and discipline into the warriors that the world would both fear and admire. For the rest of Greece, the agoge was a strange, even brutal system. But for Sparta, it was the foundation of greatness. And for those of us looking back, it is a reminder of how very different life can be, depending on the values a society holds above all else. Chapter 3. Surviving the Training. By the time a Spartan boy had settled into the agoge, the real test began. It was one thing to be taken from home at the age of 7, and quite another to endure the years that followed. The agoge was not a short program, nor was it a brief challenge. It was a long, unrelenting crucible, and survival within it was as much about the mind as it was about the body. For most children, growth is measured in school lessons, friendships, and family milestones. For a Spartan boy, growth was measured in endurance, how much hunger he could tolerate, how far he could run, how many blows he could withstand without crying out. Every day was a quiet battle, not against an enemy, but against weakness itself. Food remained a constant challenge. Meals were deliberately small, designed not to satisfy, but to sharpen. Boys ate the infamous Spartan black broth, a mixture of boiled pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. To outsiders, it was almost inedible, a dish of bitterness and heaviness. To Spartans, it was fuel, nothing more, nothing less. But it was never enough. Hunger was meant to gnaw at them, to push them into cleverness. They were encouraged to steal food from gardens, kitchens, or even nearby farms. But the lesson was not in the theft itself. The lesson was in cunning, in patience, and in silence. If caught, the punishment was not for breaking the rules, but for failing to escape notice. This practice carried into every part of life. The agoge was not about avoiding hardship, but about mastering it. Cold nights were spent with only a thin cloak. Winters were endured barefoot. Summers baked their skin under the relentless sun. Pain, hunger, and exhaustion became familiar companions, and each boy was expected to treat them not as enemies, but as teachers. To survive meant to accept discomfort without complaint. Physical training was constant. Days were filled with running across rough ground, wrestling, sparring with wooden weapons, and endless drills. These were not games of sport, but preparations for war. Bruises and cuts were ignored. Broken bones might receive little more than a rough bandage. Toughness was valued more than healing. To flinch at pain was shameful. To endure in silence was honorable. One of the most telling practices of the agoge was the ritual whipping at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys were flogged, sometimes until blood streamed down their backs, while spectators looked on. The purpose was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a test of endurance. The boy who bore the lashes without a sound proved his worth. The one who cried out revealed weakness. It is said that some boys died under the lash, and yet their deaths were treated as honorable sacrifices to the goddess and to Sparta as ideals of endurance. But survival was not only about the body. The agoge tested the mind as well. Boys were encouraged to think quickly, to respond with sharp, concise words. The famous Spartan brevity, that laconic wit admired across Greece, was born in these years. To waste words was considered a flaw. To speak wisely and briefly was a mark of discipline. Even in conversation, the agoge demanded control. Older boys were set over younger ones, creating a hierarchy within the training system. The older youths enforced discipline, sometimes harshly, but also acted as mentors. This system built bonds across age groups, teaching boys to respect authority while also preparing them to lead in turn. The lessons were layered: how to obey, how to command, and how to endure both roles without complaint. The agoge also trained boys in tactics. Mock battles were staged, not as playful contests, but as rehearsals for real combat. Boys learned how to hold formation, how to move in unison, how to trust the shield beside them. A single mistake could bring the wrath of instructors, for in a real battle, one man's failure could unravel the entire line. Every movement mattered. Every lesson was survival. As the years passed, the tests grew harsher. Adolescence in Sparta was not a time of freedom, but of deeper trials. At times, boys were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a cloak and their wits. They had to survive by hunting, stealing, and hiding. This ordeal was more than a test of survival skills. It was also a test of stealth, because Helots, the enslaved people of Sparta, were often the ones targeted. These expeditions blurred the line between training and cruelty, but they reflected the Spartan belief that mastery of survival meant mastery of others. Punishments were swift and unrelenting. A boy who failed at his tasks might be whipped, starved, or humiliated, yet failure was not the end. The agoge was designed to break a boy down and rebuild him, over and over, until there was no weakness left to show. Shame was a powerful force in Spartan society, and the fear of it drove boys to push past their limits. Despite the severity, bonds of deep loyalty grew within the agoge. Shared hardship forged friendships as strong as iron. Boys came to rely on one another, to trust each other in ways that mirrored the battlefield itself. Alone, a boy might falter. Together, they endured. This was the heart of Sparta, its military strength, the unity born of years spent suffering side by side. When outsiders looked at the agoge, they often saw barbarity. Athenians, for instance, were shocked at the harshness. To them, childhood was a time to cultivate the mind with philosophy, literature, and art. In Sparta, childhood was stripped of ornament, and only the core remained: discipline, endurance, loyalty. Both systems reflected their values. Athens produced thinkers. Sparta produced warriors. To imagine yourself in the agoge is to imagine a childhood without softness. No comfort from home, no gentle indulgence, no escape from discipline. Every day was measured by endurance. How long you could run, how long you could go hungry, how much pain you could suffer without revealing it. Most of us, if placed in that system, would falter quickly. Hunger would gnaw, cold would bite, pain would overwhelm. But for a Spartan boy, to endure was not extraordinary. It was expected. By the time he reached his teenage years, a Spartan had already survived what most of us could never bear. The agoge shaped not just soldiers, but a mindset that treated suffering as natural and weakness as deadly. Survival here was not just about lasting the day. It was about lasting a lifetime under the constant shadow of war. And so, the boy who endured the agoge became a man molded for the battlefield, lean, hardened, disciplined, and utterly devoted to Sparta. For him, survival was no longer a question. It was his very identity. Chapter 4. Becoming a Warrior at 20. By the time a Spartan youth reached the age of 20, he had already endured more hardship than most of us could imagine. The years in the agoge had stripped him of comfort, shaped his body into a weapon, and bound his loyalty to Sparta above all else. Yet at 20, he did not suddenly become free. Instead, he stepped into a new phase of life, that of a warrior, fully recognized as a member of Sparta's military brotherhood. This transition was one of the most important milestones in a Spartan's life. It marked the end of childhood training and the beginning of full responsibility. A young man was no longer simply surviving trials set by his instructors. Now he was expected to live by the code he had been trained to embody. The agoge was preparation. The years that followed were practice for real war. At 20, a Spartan became eligible to join the Syssitia, the communal mess halls where warriors ate, lived, and bonded. These were not casual dining halls or places of comfort. The Syssitia were more like sacred brotherhoods, where men shared their lives with one another. Acceptance into one was not guaranteed. Each mess hall voted on new members, and a single black ball of rejection could mean denial. For a young warrior, being excluded was devastating, for it meant dishonor and separation from his peers. To eat with one's comrades was a privilege, and only those deemed worthy could claim it. Inside the Syssitia, life was both simple and demanding. Meals were plain, often nothing more than barley bread, cheese, figs, and the ever-present black broth. Food was not about indulgence, but about necessity. To sit at the table was not to feast, but to share in equality. Each man contributed monthly from his share of crops or spoils, and failing to provide meant disgrace. In this way, the mess hall tied every Spartan to both his brothers and the larger system of the state. The Syssitia were also places of conversation and discipline. Stories of bravery were told, lessons were repeated, and decisions were made. Older men watched younger ones, ensuring that arrogance did not take root. Respect for elders was a constant theme, and humility was expected. Even at the table, discipline ruled. To eat, speak, and behave with composure was as much a test as the battles fought in training. Outside the mess halls, life at 20 meant constant readiness. A Spartan warrior could be called to march at any time. He was trained, armed, and expected to live as though battle might arrive at his doorstep each morning. Training continued daily, running, wrestling, sparring with weapons, and practicing the phalanx formation. The lessons of the agoge never ended. They simply shifted into the rhythms of adult life. The bond with fellow warriors deepened in these years. Living together, training together, eating together, all of this forged a brotherhood stronger than any family tie. In Sparta, loyalty to the unit was paramount. Personal ambition, personal comfort, even personal safety, all were secondary to the duty of holding the line. A Spartan's worth was measured not by what he did alone, but by how steadfastly he stood beside his comrades. Marriage, too, entered the picture around this age, though in a uniquely Spartan way. While a young man could marry, he did not yet live at home with his wife. Instead, he continued to live in the barracks with his fellow warriors, returning to his household only when granted leave or when able to slip away. This arrangement underscored the idea that Sparta, not the family, came first. Marriage was important for producing the next generation of warriors, but it did not free a man from his obligations to the state. By 20, the discipline of the agoge had become instinct. A Spartan no longer questioned hunger, cold, or hardship. He accepted them as natural parts of existence. His body was lean, hardened by years of training. His mind was sharp, trained to respond quickly and decisively. And his spirit was bound by the code of Sparta, to live with honor, to endure without complaint, and to fight without fear. Yet even as a warrior, a young man was still under scrutiny. The elders and commanders watched closely, judging his behavior, his discipline, and his bravery. Recognition was not immediate. True honor had to be earned, often in battle. Until then, the young warrior lived in the shadow of expectation, always aware that failure meant disgrace. Life at 20 was a delicate balance between preparation and reality. A Spartan had crossed into adulthood, but he was still not considered fully mature. That honor came later, at 30, when a man became a full citizen with voting rights in the assembly. The decade between 20 and 30 was one of service, proving oneself in war, enduring the hardships of the Syssitia, and embodying the ideals of Sparta. This long testing period reflects the deep seriousness with which Spartans treated the role of warrior. It was not enough to train as a child. It was not enough to pass into adulthood. Every year was another trial, another chance to prove loyalty, courage, and discipline. For most of us today, reaching 20 means a time of exploration, of choosing paths, of discovering freedom. In Sparta, it meant doubling down on the life already chosen, a life of sacrifice, structure, and unwavering obedience. Picture yourself at 20 years old. Perhaps you were studying, working, or just beginning to build a life of your own. Now imagine instead that every day was consumed by training, drills, and communal meals of black broth. Imagine that you had no choice about where you lived, who you ate with, or how you spent your time. Your life belonged not to you, but to the state. Your closest bonds were not with your family, but with the warriors who sat beside you in the mess hall. This was the reality of a Spartan at 20. And so, the journey from child to man in Sparta was not a leap, but a long, steady march. Every step reinforced the same lessons: discipline, unity, and sacrifice. By 20, a Spartan was not simply a young man. He was a soldier in waiting, a piece of the greater phalanx, ready to take his place in the line of battle. For us, the idea of such a life seems almost unbearable. But for the Spartans, it was the only way to live. Their city demanded warriors, and from birth to adulthood, every step prepared them for that role. By 20, they were no longer boys of the agoge. They were warriors of Sparta, living proof that survival itself was a victory. Chapter 5. Weapons and Armor of Sparta. A Spartan warrior at 20 was no longer just a youth in training. He was now expected to master the tools of his trade, the weapons and armor that made the Spartan phalanx one of the most feared forces in the ancient world. To us today, the thought of carrying heavy bronze gear and sharp steel into battle feels distant, even cinematic. But for a Spartan, it was not a costume, nor a symbol. It was survival. The most important piece of a Spartan's equipment was his shield, known as the hoplon. From this shield came the very name of the hoplite, the heavily armed infantrymen who formed the backbone of Greek armies. But the Spartan shield was more than just a slab of bronze and wood. It was the very soul of the warrior. Large and round, nearly 3 feet across, it curved outward, its bronze surface gleaming in the sun. Behind that bronze was a wooden core, thick enough to absorb blows, yet light enough to carry with training. The shield was heavy, often weighing around 15 pounds, and it was not carried lightly. Its leather straps allowed a warrior to grip it firmly, his left arm slipping through one loop while his hand clasped another. The design meant the shield rested on the shoulder as much as in the hand, spreading its weight but demanding endurance. Holding it for hours on end was exhausting, and yet it was expected. The shield was not just for defense. It was for the protection of the man beside you. In the phalanx, each shield overlapped with the next, creating a wall of bronze. To drop one's shield was to leave not only yourself, but your comrades exposed. That is why Spartan mothers were said to tell their sons, "Return with your shield or on it." Alongside the shield was the spear, the dory. This was the primary weapon of a Spartan warrior, a long shaft of ash wood, tipped with a leaf-shaped iron spearhead and balanced with a bronze butt spike at the other end. At about 7 to 9 feet in length, it was both unwieldy and deadly. The spear was designed not just for thrusting, but for holding the enemy at bay. In the tight ranks of the phalanx, spears projected outward like the spines of a hedgehog, forming a barrier no enemy wished to approach. The bronze butt spike, called the soritor or lizard killer, was used to finish off fallen foes or to plant the spear in the ground. The dory demanded strength and coordination. A single thrust required the balance of the shield, the push of the legs, and the rhythm of the unit. In battle, Spartans fought as one, their spears striking in unison, their shields locking together. Alone, the spear was difficult. Together, it was devastating. But battles are never predictable, and spears could break in the clash of war. That was when the Spartan turned to his secondary weapon, the xiphos. This short sword, often less than 2 feet long, was leaf-shaped, designed for stabbing in close quarters when the spear was gone. Though small, it was deadly in tight spaces, where shields pressed close and enemies grappled at arm's length. Some Spartans also carried the kopis, a heavier curved sword with a chopping edge, favored for brutal power. These weapons were matched with armor that made the Spartan a walking fortress. The helmet, or Corinthian helmet, was one of the most recognizable pieces. Made of bronze, it covered the entire head and face, leaving only narrow eye slits and a small opening for the mouth. Its crest, often of horsehair, rose high, giving the warrior an imposing presence. To wear such a helmet was to see the world through slits of bronze, to hear the muffled sound of battle, and to breathe the hot, trapped air inside. It was protective, but also suffocating. The cuirass, or breastplate, was another crucial piece. Early versions were made of bronze, molded to the shape of the chest and back. Later, some Spartans wore lighter linen or leather armor, reinforced with metal scales. Heavy as it was, the bronze cuirass turned the warrior's torso into a shield of its own, deflecting arrows, spears, and blades. Greaves of bronze protected the shins, strapped tight against the skin, while sometimes arm guards added further defense. Taken together, the full panoply, shield, spear, sword, helmet, cuirass, greaves weighed upwards of 70 pounds. To march in this gear for hours, to fight in it under the blazing sun, required incredible endurance. Most of us today would stagger beneath such weight, let alone fight with precision. But for a Spartan, the armor was not a burden. It was an extension of the body, trained into familiarity through years of drills. Even the appearance of the Spartan warrior carried weight. Their shields were painted with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon, the broader region of Sparta. This mark was not just decoration, it was a statement of unity. An enemy looking across the battlefield would see row upon row of shields, each bearing the same emblem, a wall of bronze advancing in silence. The sight alone was often enough to chill the courage of opposing troops. The red cloak, too, was distinctive. Spartans wore crimson so that wounds would be less visible, hiding the sight of blood from their enemies, and perhaps even from themselves. It was a symbol of fearlessness, a reminder that pain was not to be acknowledged. The cloak also set them apart visually, marking them as Spartans, different from other Greeks, instantly recognizable on the battlefield. But equipment alone did not make the Spartan warrior. Anyone can pick up a spear or strap on a helmet. What made the Spartan unique was the discipline with which he used them. Hours of training forged muscle memory, so that the spear was always at the right angle, the shield always in place, the step always in rhythm with the phalanx. The weapons and armor were tools, but the true weapon was the unity of the men themselves. Imagine for a moment carrying that weight. 70 pounds of bronze and wood pressing on your shoulders, sweat dripping beneath a suffocating helmet, breath heavy, legs straining, the shield biting into your arm, the spear trembling in your grip as the enemy presses forward. Most of us would falter within minutes. But the Spartan was expected to endure for hours, through marshes, through battle, through endless repetition. The armor was hot, heavy, and unforgiving. The weapons were sharp, deadly, and demanding. But together, they created the image of Sparta, a wall of bronze, a storm of spears, a brotherhood that seemed unbreakable. To live as a Spartan meant to carry this weight not for a single day, but for a lifetime. And so, the weapons and armor of Sparta were more than metal and wood. They were symbols of a life built on endurance, tools of a state that demanded perfection, and burdens that no outsider could easily bear. Chapter 6. The Spartan Way of Battle. If weapons and armor were the tools of a Spartan warrior, then the true art lay in how those tools were used. To the Spartans, war was not a matter of reckless bravery or individual glory. It was a carefully practiced craft, honed through years of training, and carried out with the precision of a machine. At the center of this craft was the phalanx, the tight formation that made Spartan armies legendary. The phalanx was not unique to Sparta. Other Greek city-states also fought in this way, but nowhere else was it practiced with such discipline and perfection. To stand in the Spartan phalanx was to become a living piece of a greater shield, a wall of bronze and muscle moving as one. For the individual, it meant giving up personal freedom in the heat of battle. For the unit, it meant near invincibility. The mechanics were simple, but the execution was demanding. Each warrior stood shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, spear angled forward. The first few rows thrust their weapons at the enemy, while those behind pressed forward, adding weight and momentum to the line. The phalanx was a living wall, advancing step by step, unbroken, relentless. To hold your place in the line was everything. To falter, even for a moment, could open a gap that the enemy would exploit. It was here that the Spartan training showed its worth. Years of living in barracks, eating together, marching together, enduring hardship together, all of it prepared them for this moment. In battle, they moved not as individuals, but as one body, each man's shield guarding the man beside him. A Spartan warrior's right side was always exposed, as the shield covered mostly the left. This meant survival depended on trust. Your comrade's shield protected you, just as your shield protected him. Cowardice was not just shameful, it was deadly. Commands were given in rhythm, often with the accompaniment of flutes or pipes. Music in battle might seem strange, but to the Spartans it was essential. The steady notes guided their steps, kept the line even, and prevented panic. In the chaos of battle, discipline mattered more than strength. An unbroken rhythm kept the phalanx whole, while disorder led to ruin. When two phalanxes clashed, it was less like the elegant duels often imagined in stories, and more like the grinding force of storms colliding. Spears jabbed, shields slammed, men shouted and pushed with all their might. The front lines pressed against each other in a deadly contest of endurance. Behind them, ranks shoved forward, adding crushing weight. Sometimes battles turned into contests of sheer force, the two sides pushing until one broke. In those moments, training, discipline, and unity decided the outcome. For the Spartans, retreat was unthinkable. They were taught that survival came not from running, but from standing firm. Their shields and spears were extensions of their identity, their place in the phalanx more important than their own lives. Death was acceptable. Dishonor was not. To break formation, to drop your shield, to run from the line, these were acts that scarred not only the man but his entire family. A Spartan could fall, but he could never falter. The Spartan way of battle also relied on psychological warfare. Their reputation alone often unsettled opponents. Enemies knew that Spartans would not waver, would not break, would not panic. To face them meant facing a wall of men who had trained for this single purpose from childhood. Stories of their endurance spread across Greece, making their presence on the battlefield as much a weapon as their spears. But life in the phalanx was not just about courage. It was about endless practice. Spartans drilled relentlessly, marching in formation until it became second nature. They learned to pivot as a unit, to advance and retreat in step, to adjust their ranks on command. The smallest movement was rehearsed over and over, so that in battle there was no hesitation. For the Spartans, the phalanx was not just a tactic, it was a way of life. Yet this way of battle was grueling. Imagine yourself locked in formation, shield pressed against your arm, sweat running down your face beneath a heavy bronze helmet. The air is filled with shouts, the clash of metal, the sound of men straining against one another. Your spear thrusts again and again. Your muscles burn. Your legs ache from holding the line. Behind you, your comrades press forward, giving you no room to falter. In front of you, the enemy pushes with equal force. Hours may pass in this grinding contest, and still you cannot step back. For most of us, the weight of armor alone would be overwhelming. For the Spartans, it was their daily reality. Victory in such battles was rarely swift. Often it came when one side's discipline failed. A gap opened, the line bent, and suddenly the wall was broken. At that moment, the Spartans' unity became most dangerous. With a cry, they would surge forward, spears stabbing, shields battering, cutting through the enemy's weakness with brutal efficiency. What had been a stalemate could turn to slaughter in minutes. The phalanx was not invincible. Rough terrain could break its order, cavalry could outmaneuver it, and sheer numbers could overwhelm it. But for centuries, the Spartan version of the phalanx remained unmatched. Their devotion to discipline, their refusal to flee, and their unity of purpose gave them an edge that few could match. And yet, the cost was immense. The phalanx demanded not only physical endurance, but the complete sacrifice of individuality. To be a Spartan warrior was to surrender personal freedom for the collective. You did not fight for yourself, but for the man beside you, for the unit, for Sparta. This was the essence of their strength, but also the burden that defined their lives. To us today, the Spartan way of battle may seem distant, almost ceremonial in its rigidity. But for the men who stood in those lines, it was the difference between life and death, survival and destruction. The shield, the spear, the formation, all were pieces of a larger whole, forged in discipline and tested in blood. And so, to last even a day as a Spartan warrior meant not just carrying the weight of armor, but carrying the weight of an entire society's expectations. To falter in the phalanx was to fail not only yourself, but every man around you. It was a burden few of us could endure. But for the Spartans, it was life itself. Chapter 7. Daily Life of a Warrior. The image of the Spartan warrior often comes to us from battlefields, shields locked, spears thrusting, helmets gleaming beneath the sun. Yet most days in a Spartan's life were not spent in open combat. Wars were frequent, but they did not consume every waking hour. The true test of a Spartan's endurance lay in the ordinary rhythm of daily life, which was anything but ordinary by our standards. To live as a Spartan warrior was to live in constant preparation. From the moment of waking, a man was reminded that he was not his own master, but a servant of the state. His day belonged to Sparta, his strength belonged to his brothers, and his body was never free from the demands of discipline. Morning began early, often with drills or exercises. Sleep was not a luxury. Warriors slept lightly, wrapped in cloaks, their beds made of reeds or straw. Comfort was not encouraged, for too much softness might dull the edge of endurance. Rising before dawn, they might run long distances, spar with one another, or practice maneuvers with shields and spears. The routine was not meant to entertain or even to challenge, but to maintain readiness. Every day was training for the moment when war would call. Meals, as ever, were simple. The black broth that Spartans were infamous for remained a staple, pork boiled with blood, salt, and vinegar. Outsiders who tasted it often recoiled, declaring it unfit for civilized people. But for Spartans, it was sustenance, plain and functional. Alongside it came bread made from barley, a grain considered rougher and less refined than wheat. Cheese, figs, and olives might appear in modest portions, but the meals were deliberately unadorned. Luxury was avoided because it was seen as corrupting. A Spartan's stomach, like his body, was to remain lean and disciplined. Meals were eaten in the syssitia, the communal mess halls that define much of a warrior's existence. These halls were not just dining places. They were the beating heart of Spartan society. Here, men shared food, conversation, and responsibility. Attendance was mandatory, and each man contributed to the monthly rations from his share of crops or from spoils of war. To fail in this duty was disgraceful. Inside the syssitia, conversation was as regulated as the food. Stories of bravery were told, lessons repeated, speeches short and sharp. Spartan wit, brief, cutting, memorable, was admired here. Young men learned not only to fight beside their comrades, but to eat, to laugh, to think in unison with them. In this way, even the act of sharing a meal became an extension of the phalanx. Throughout the day, warriors continued training. Wrestling and boxing were common, not only for strength, but for agility and toughness. Archery, hunting, and running honed survival skills. Weapon practice drilled the motions until they became instinct. The exercises were repetitive, but repetition was the point. Muscle, mind, and spirit had to be bound into a single discipline. But life was not only about drills. Spartan warriors were also guardians of their city. Patrols were common, especially to keep watch over the Helot population, whose numbers far exceeded those of the Spartans. The constant fear of Helot rebellion meant that warriors lived in a state of vigilance, their days punctuated by duties of control and intimidation. The Helots farmed the land, producing the food that sustained Sparta, but they did so under the shadow of Spartan authority. Family life, for those married, was sharply limited. A man might be wed, but until he reached the age of 30, he continued to live in the barracks, visiting his wife only when allowed or when able to sneak away. Even then, family was secondary to duty. A Spartan warrior's true home was not his household, but his mess hall. His true family was his comrades. The city-state demanded this priority, ensuring that loyalty to Sparta always outweighed loyalty to self. Despite the harshness, bonds of friendship and fraternity thrived. Daily life in the barracks created connections as strong as blood ties. To eat together, train together, and suffer together forged a unity that could not easily be broken. For Spartans, these bonds were life itself. On the battlefield, it was this loyalty, not abstract ideals, not personal glory, that kept the phalanx unbroken. Each man stood firm not only for Sparta, but for the friend beside him. Religious rituals also punctuated daily life. Sparta was deeply pious, and warriors regularly offered sacrifices to the gods. Festivals and ceremonies reinforced the values of courage, discipline, and unity. Music and dance were practiced, but always with military undertones. Songs celebrated victory and bravery, while dances mimicked movements of battle. Even leisure reflected preparation for war. Yet for all this, Spartan warriors were not without moments of quiet. In the afternoons or evenings, they might gather to share stories, test each other's wit, or reflect on the deeds of ancestors. While the world often imagines Spartans as humorless and stern, there is evidence that laughter, song, and companionship were part of their lives. What made them different was that these joys were always bound within discipline, never separate from their purpose as warriors. Daily life was, in many ways, a kind of battle of its own, not against enemies abroad, but against softness, temptation, and weakness within. To us, the idea of living every moment under such restraint may feel suffocating. But to a Spartan, this was freedom of a different kind. It was freedom from indecision, freedom from distraction, freedom from the uncertainties of a world where survival often depended on unity and strength. Imagine yourself living that life. No comfortable bed, no variety of food, no lazy mornings or idle afternoons. Every day structured, every action guided by the needs of the state. Your body constantly tested, your will constantly measured, your loyalty constantly demanded. For most of us, such a life would wear us down within days. But for the Spartans, it was the only life worth living. Daily existence for a Spartan warrior was not glamorous. It was repetitive, harsh, and demanding. And yet, it was this very discipline, this unyielding rhythm, that made them into the soldiers the world still remembers. They may not have fought every day, but they lived as though battle could come with the dawn. In this way, each ordinary day became extraordinary, a constant rehearsal for survival. Chapter 8. The Helots' Role. To understand the life of a Spartan warrior, we cannot focus only on the barracks, the battles, or the mess halls. Behind the polished bronze of their shields and the fierce discipline of their training stood another group of people, the Helots. Without them, Sparta could not have existed as it did. Yet the Helots lived in a shadowed world, one of toil, fear, and subjugation. Their role was essential, and at the same time, it was one of the harshest realities of Spartan society. The Helots were not foreigners captured in distant wars, nor were they slaves bought in markets. They were the original inhabitants of the land of Messenia and Laconia, regions conquered by Sparta in earlier centuries. When the Spartans seized these territories, they did not simply drive out the population. Instead, they bound them to the land, forcing them to work the fields, provide food, and serve the needs of the state. Generations were born into this condition. A Helot child grew up knowing he would never be free, just as his parents and grandparents before him had lived under Spartan rule. The Helots' primary duty was agriculture. They tilled the fields, planted crops, harvested grain, tended olive groves, and cared for vineyards. They raised livestock, carried heavy loads, and supplied the produce that filled Spartan mess halls. Every Spartan warrior depended on them for survival. Without Helot labor, the warriors could not have spent their lives training and drilling, for someone had to provide the daily bread and the barley that sustained the Syssitia. In this way, the Helots bore the physical burden of Sparta's survival. And yet, despite this reliance, the Spartans lived in constant fear of their Helots. They outnumbered the Spartans by a large margin. Some estimates say 7-1. A rebellion by the Helots could have destroyed the Spartan system. The warrior's harsh daily life was not only about preparing for wars abroad, but also about keeping control at home. Each Spartan lived with the knowledge that his city's strength depended on keeping the Helots subdued. This fear shaped many aspects of Spartan life. Every year, according to some accounts, the Spartan authorities declared ritual war on the Helots. This curious practice meant that killing a Helot was not considered murder during this period. It was a legal and symbolic way to remind both Spartans and Helots of the balance of power. Young warriors, especially those fresh from the agoge, were sometimes sent in the countryside to test themselves by killing Helots in stealth. This practice, though grim, was seen as a way to harden warriors while also keeping the Helot population intimidated. The Helots themselves lived in constant tension. Their work was essential, but their status was precarious. They were not chattel slaves who could be sold abroad, yet they had no rights of freedom. They belonged to the land and to the state, and their lives were shaped by the demands of others. They could marry, raise families, and hold homes of their own, but all under the watchful shadow of Spartan oversight. Despite the oppression, the Helots were not without spirit. History tells us of several uprisings, most notably after a devastating earthquake in Sparta around 465 BCE. In the chaos, the Helots seized the chance to rebel, rising in armed resistance that threatened the very survival of the city. The revolt was eventually crushed, but it left deep scars. For centuries afterward, the Spartans lived with the knowledge that their dominance was fragile, resting on the shoulders of an oppressed majority. To the outside world, the Helots were both pitied and scorned. Some Greek writers mocked them, describing how Spartans forced Helots to drink wine until they were drunk, then displayed them to Spartan youths as an example of disgraceful behavior. Others condemned the cruelty of the system, seeing in it a contradiction, a society that prized freedom for its warriors, built entirely on the unfreedom of others. And yet, for the Spartans themselves, the Helots were part of the natural order. The warrior class could exist only because someone else labored in the fields. Discipline and military excellence could flourish only because the daily work of survival, food, farming, tending the land, was handled by others. In this way, the Helots were as essential to Sparta as the shield and spear. They were unseen partners in the creation of the Spartan way of life, though partners bound by chains. Imagine for a moment the life of a Helot. Sunrise finds you already in the fields, hands rough from labor, body bent from years of toil. The land you work is not your own. The grain you gather will be taken to feed men who train with spears and shields, men who treat you with suspicion and scorn. Each day carries the weight of fear. Fear that your family might be punished for some imagined disobedience. Fear that your life could be ended without consequence. Yet in spite of it, you endure. You plant, you harvest, you feed the very warriors who depend on your silence. This duality, warriors above, laborers below, defines Sparta. To admire the Spartan soldier is also to remember the Helot who enabled him. Without Helots, the phalanx could not march. Without Helots, the mess halls would stand empty. Without Helots, Sparta itself would crumble. And yet, the Helots are often forgotten in the stories of bronze helmets and crimson cloaks. Their lives remind us that even the fiercest societies are built on hidden foundations. In many ways, the Helots bore a burden as heavy as any shield. They carried the weight of Spartan survival, not on the battlefield, but in the fields of grain and groves of olives. Their endurance, though uncelebrated, was as vital as the discipline of the warrior. They remind us that history is not only shaped by those who fight, but also by those who labor unseen. For us, it is easy to imagine ourselves as the warrior, clad in bronze, standing in the phalanx. It is harder, but perhaps more revealing, to imagine ourselves as the Helot, toiling in silence, living in fear, yet shaping history all the same. Chapter 9. The Spartan Code of Discipline. If there was one quality that defined the Spartan way of life above all else, it was discipline. From the first breath of a child inspected at birth to the last stand of a warrior on the battlefield, discipline shaped every moment. It was not simply a rule to follow, nor a lesson learned once and forgotten. For the Spartans, discipline was a way of being, woven so deeply into their identity that to live without it was unthinkable. The Spartan code of discipline began with silence. Boys in the agoge were taught to speak little and only when necessary. Words were to be sharp, brief, and meaningful. Idle chatter was frowned upon, and long speeches were seen as a sign of weakness. This habit of silence carried into adulthood, creating the laconic style of speech that made Spartans famous. To outsiders, their short answers could seem cold, even rude. To Spartans, they were proof of control over one's tongue, one's thoughts, one's emotions. Self-control extended far beyond speech. A Spartan warrior was expected to master his body as well as his mind. Hunger, thirst, cold, heat, these were to be endured without complaint. Pain was to be met with silence, wounds borne without whimper. In a world where survival on the battlefield depended on steadiness, a warrior who cried out in fear or faltered under hardship was a liability. To show weakness was more shameful than to die. This discipline was reinforced daily through punishments and rituals. A boy caught stealing food, a youth who failed in a drill, a warrior who disobeyed an order, all could expect harsh correction. Whipping, public shame, or extra duties were not cruel punishments, but necessary reminders. The Spartans believed that without constant reinforcement, discipline would wither. Better to endure small pains in life than to collapse in the greater trial of war. Yet discipline was not only about endurance, it was also about obedience. A Spartan warrior was expected to follow orders without hesitation. In the phalanx, there was no room for doubt. A command to advance, to retreat, to hold the line, each had to be obeyed instantly, for hesitation could bring disaster. The phalanx was only as strong as its weakest link, and obedience ensured its unity. Obedience did not mean blind servitude, however. Spartans valued cunning and resourcefulness, especially in individual survival. But within the phalanx, within the structure of war, obedience was absolute. It was this paradox, individual toughness, balanced with collective obedience, that made them so effective in battle. The code of discipline extended to daily life as well. In the Syssitia, the communal mess halls, men ate modestly and spoke sparingly. They contributed to the common pot, accepted the same simple meals, and carried themselves with restraint. Luxury was considered dangerous, a threat to equality and unity. To indulge in excess food, drink, or comfort was to weaken the very fabric of Spartan society. Discipline was as much about what one did not do as about what one did. Honor was another pillar of this code. A Spartan's worth was measured by his ability to uphold the values of his city. To die bravely in battle was considered the highest honor. To flee was the deepest disgrace. Cowardice was remembered, not just by the man himself, but by his family and descendants. Shame could outlive a lifetime, casting a shadow across generations. In this way, the code of discipline reached beyond the individual, binding families to the same standard. One of the most striking examples of this discipline is seen in their attitude toward death. Spartans were taught from childhood not to fear it. To stand firm, shield in hand, even when defeat was certain, was considered the noblest act. It is said that when asked why their warriors fought so fearlessly, Spartans replied, "Because we fear our laws more than the enemy." To them, the greater terror was not the spear or the sword, but the shame of breaking the code. This mindset created a society unlike any other in Greece. In Athens, citizens debated in assembly, enjoying luxuries of art and philosophy. In Thebes or Corinth, men sought wealth, trade, and personal success. In Sparta, the highest achievement was self-denial. Discipline was the true currency, honor the true reward. A man who mastered himself was richer than any merchant, greater than any poet. Discipline also shaped the role of women in Sparta. Spartan women, though not warriors, were expected to live with the same restraint and pride. They exercised, managed households, and spoke boldly, but always with the expectation that their lives served the state. They too lived under the shadow of the code, urging their sons to return from war with their shields, or on them. Their pride, their sharp tongues, and their endurance reflected the same values as their husbands and brothers. To imagine yourself under this code is to imagine a life stripped of softness. Every word measured, every action judged, every weakness punished. Your days filled with discipline, your nights with the awareness that even in rest, you serve the state. The comforts we take for granted, warm meals, free speech, indulgence and leisure, would all be considered dangerous distractions. Your worth would not be measured by wealth, talent, or kindness, but by how well you endured, obeyed, and upheld the honor of your city. And yet, this discipline was also a source of strength. It created unity unmatched in the ancient world. It bound men together in ways that wealth and luxury could not. It gave Sparta its reputation as a city of warriors, feared and respected across Greece. The code of discipline was harsh, but it gave them a kind of immortality in history. For us today, it is almost unimaginable to live every moment under such scrutiny, to measure life not by personal happiness, but by obedience and restraint, feels suffocating. But for the Spartans, it was freedom of another kind. Freedom from chaos, freedom from weakness, freedom from dishonor. Their code was not just a set of rules. It was their identity, the very thing that made them Spartan. And so, when we ask why we would not last a day as Spartan warriors, part of the answer lies here. It is not only the weight of bronze or the clash of battle that would undo us. It is the unyielding discipline, the silence, the self-denial, the obedience that shaped every moment. To live under such a code would test not just the body, but the very soul. Chapter 10. Marriage and Family, Spartan Style. When we think of marriage, most of us imagine a bond built on affection, companionship, and the warmth of home. In Sparta, however, even marriage was shaped by the needs of the state. Love and comfort were secondary to duty, and family life was always subject to the greater demands of discipline, loyalty, and the production of strong children for the city. Marriage in Sparta often began later than in other Greek states. Spartan men usually married in their mid to late 20s, though they continued to live in the barracks until the age of 30. This meant that even after marriage, a man's daily life remained centered on his comrades and his duties to the state. Home and family were secondary, visited in secret or in short intervals. While the warrior's true household remained the mess hall, the rituals of marriage themselves were unusual. In many accounts, the ceremony was brief and symbolic, reflecting Sparta's emphasis on simplicity. A woman's head might be shaved, her hair cut short like a boy's, and she would be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. The groom would then visit her under the cover of night, often in secret, before returning to his barracks by morning. This ritual may seem strange, but it reflected deeper values: the transition from girlhood to womanhood, the idea of strength over beauty, and the practical demands of a warrior society where men could not spend their days at home. The secrecy of these meetings did not mean that Spartan marriages lacked affection. On the contrary, many sources suggest that these stolen moments created a bond of longing and intensity. Husbands and wives grew close through brief encounters, savoring what little time they could spend together. But always, the greater demand of Sparta loomed over personal happiness. A warrior's duty to the state outweighed his duty to his household. The purpose of marriage was, above all, the production of children, children who would one day serve Sparta as warriors or mothers of warriors. Spartan society was deeply concerned with the health and strength of its offspring. Women were expected to maintain their bodies through exercise and diet so that they could bear strong sons. Unlike in most of Greece, Spartan women trained in running, wrestling, and other athletic pursuits. The reasoning was clear. Only a strong woman could give birth to strong children. The state also took a practical, even unsettling, interest in reproduction. If a man was thought to be too old or weak to produce healthy heirs, arrangements could be made for another, stronger man to father children with his wife. Likewise, if a woman was considered especially strong, she might be encouraged to bear children from men other than her husband, ensuring the vitality of the next generation. These practices, though unusual to us, reflected Sparta's focus on survival and strength over personal convention. Family life, though secondary, was not without significance. Spartan mothers, in particular, held a powerful role. They were known for their pride, their sharp tongues, and their unwavering devotion to Sparta's ideals. A mother might give her son his shield before battle with the famous words, "Return with it, or on it." This was not cruelty, but the highest expression of Spartan values, that honor mattered more than life itself. Women, though not warriors, were seen as guardians of the code, passing on discipline to the next generation. Children raised in these households grew up with the same expectations that had shaped their parents. Boys were destined for the agoge, leaving their families at the age of 7 to enter the harsh training system. Girls remained at home but continued their physical education, preparing themselves for motherhood and the responsibilities of managing estates while their husbands trained or fought. The family unit existed, but always in service to the state. Spartan women also had unusual independence compared to other Greek women. While women in Athens were largely confined to the home, Spartan women could own and inherit property, manage estates, and speak more freely in public. This was not because Sparta valued equality, but because the constant absence of men required women to take on greater responsibilities. They became the stewards of the land, the managers of wealth, and the sustainers of daily life, while their husbands lived in the barracks. This independence gave them a reputation throughout Greece as bold and outspoken, admired by some, ridiculed by others. Marriage, then, was less about personal companionship and more about strengthening the state. Love may have existed, but it was never the focus. The bond between husband and wife was shaped by absence, secrecy, and duty. Families were important, but they were always overshadowed by the larger family of Sparta itself. Imagine for a moment such a marriage. You are a young man, married in ceremony, but still bound to the barracks. By day, you train, eat, and sleep among your comrades. At night, you slip away in secrecy to spend precious hours with your wife, knowing that before dawn you must return. Your children will be raised not by your hands alone, but by the state. Your wife manages the household in your absence, strong and independent, admired and feared for her sharp words and firm pride. For most of us today, this would feel alien. Marriage, as we know, it often emphasizes personal choice, emotional connection, and shared daily life. In Sparta, it was a partnership bound by necessity, endurance, and a higher goal of serving the city. The individual gave way to the collective, even within the walls of the home. And yet, for the Spartans, this arrangement made sense. Their society survived not on the comforts of family life, but on the strength of its warriors. Every custom, every ritual, every sacrifice was designed to preserve that strength. Marriage and family, like every other part of Spartan life, were not private matters, but pieces of the greater puzzle of survival. It is in this way that even the most intimate aspects of life, love, companionship, children, were shaped by discipline. To be a Spartan meant never escaping the demands of the state, not even within one's own household. This was the price of their greatness, and the burden that set them apart from all others. Chapter 11. Sparta's Women. When most people imagine the ancient Greek world, women often appear in the background, confined to the home, largely excluded from public life, their roles defined by silence and modesty. In Athens, for example, women were expected to remain indoors, rarely seen in public except for festivals or religious duties. But in Sparta, the story was different. Spartan women were not warriors themselves, but they were every bit as central to the identity of their city. They lived with a freedom, independence, and authority that shocked outsiders, and they were shaped by the same code of discipline that defined their husbands and sons. From childhood, Spartan girls received a kind of education unheard of in most of Greece. They trained their bodies with running, wrestling, discus throwing, and javelin. They exercised outdoors, in view of men and strangers, something unthinkable in Athens. This training was not frivolous. The belief was simple. Strong women produced strong children. A mother's body, healthy and resilient, was seen as the foundation for the next generation of warriors. Physical fitness was therefore a civic duty, not a personal choice. Their upbringing also included lessons in music, dance, and poetry, much like their brothers. But unlike the boys, girls were not sent away to barracks. They remained at home, growing up under the influence of mothers who were themselves strong, proud, and outspoken. In this way, the values of Sparta were passed from one generation to the next through the words and examples of women. As adults, Spartan women held responsibilities that gave them unusual power. Because men spent so much of their lives in the barracks or on campaign, women became the managers of estates and households. They oversaw the Helots, who worked the land, supervised the harvests, and ensured that contributions were sent to the Syssitia. In a society where warriors were rarely at home, women became the anchors of daily survival. Property ownership also set Spartan women apart. They could inherit land from their families and control their own wealth. By some accounts, women eventually came to own nearly 2/5 of all Spartan land. This economic power made them formidable figures in the city, able to influence society not only through their roles as mothers and wives, but also as landowners and managers. Outsiders were often astonished by this independence. To Athenians, the boldness of Spartan women seemed scandalous, a reversal of what they considered proper. To Spartans, it was simply practical necessity. Spartan women were also famous for their sharp wit and fearless speech. While men in other cities might dismiss women's words as unimportant, in Sparta, women were expected to speak plainly, even boldly. Many sayings attributed to Spartan mothers and wives reveal this frankness. When a mother handed her son his shield and said, "Return with it, or on it," she was not being cruel. She was reminding him of his duty, reinforcing the values that defined his life. When told that women in other cities had less power, one Spartan woman is said to have replied, "We are the only women who give birth to men." These remarks, whether historical or legendary, captured the pride and confidence of Spartan women. Marriage, as seen earlier, was shaped by the demands of the state, and women lived with the knowledge that their role was not simply companionship but reproduction. A woman's worth was tied to the strength of the children she bore, and this expectation weighed heavily on them. Yet they also took pride in it, seeing themselves as essential contributors to Sparta's survival. To raise a coward was shameful. To raise a brave warrior was a triumph. Despite this, life for women was not free of hardship. They lived under the same cultural pressure of discipline and sacrifice as men. Luxury was frowned upon, indulgence discouraged. Women wore simple clothing, exercised restraint, and upheld the values of moderation. Their independence was not about personal freedom in the modern sense, but about serving Sparta in their own way. Their voices also shaped the morale of the city. While men drilled in the fields or marched in battle, women kept the spirit of Sparta alive at home. Their pride, their discipline, and their sharp words echoed through the community. In this sense, they were guardians not only of households, but of ideals. They reminded the young of their duties, upheld the honor of the fallen, and ensured that shame and weakness were never tolerated. Imagine for a moment being a woman in Sparta. You rise in the morning, not to idle or remain hidden in the home, but to run, to train, to oversee the work of Helots on your land. You speak with authority, knowing that your words carry weight. You manage estates, direct resources, and ensure that the contributions to the mess halls are prepared. You are respected, but respect comes with expectation. Your body must remain strong. Your children must embody the values of Sparta. Your voice must echo discipline. Compared to women in other Greek cities, your life feels freer, but it is also heavier with responsibility. You cannot escape the demands of the state any more than your husband can. You may not fight with spear and shield, but you fight in another way, through strength of will, through the raising of warriors, through the preservation of discipline at home. Spartan women became legends not only because of their unusual freedom, but because they embodied the same spirit as the warriors themselves. Their endurance, their sharpness, and their authority gave Sparta a dual strength, one on the battlefield and one at home. Without them, the city could not have survived. And so, when we think of Sparta, we must remember not only the bronze-clad men in formation, but also the women who stood behind them, shaping their lives, sharpening their courage, and sustaining the city in its long pursuit of survival. The story of Sparta is as much theirs as it is the warriors', for without the women, there would have been no warriors at all. Chapter 12. A day on campaign for all the training, discipline, and daily routines of Spartan life. There always came a time when theory turned to reality. Campaign season was the moment when warriors left their homes, their mess halls, and their familiar routines to march into enemy lands. Life on campaign was not a break from discipline, nor was it a time of personal freedom. It was simply the Spartan way of life, extended beyond the walls of the city, with all its hardships, structure, and expectations. A campaign began long before the first step of the march. Religious rituals set the tone. Sacrifices were made to the gods, prayers were offered, and omens were read. Spartans were deeply pious, and they believed that success in war depended not only on discipline and strength, but also on the favor of the divine. Before the army moved, leaders sought the guidance of oracles, watched the flight of birds, and listened to priests who interpreted signs. No Spartan would march into war without these assurances. When the army did set out, it did so in silence and order. Warriors marched in ranks, shields strapped to their arms, spears in hand, helmets gleaming in the sunlight. Musicians played pipes to keep the rhythm, ensuring that even the long march felt like a continuation of training. To march was to practice the phalanx itself, each step measured, each pace aligned. Even away from battle, the sense of unity never faltered. The march itself was grueling. Armor and weapons weighed heavily. The sun beat down, and dust rose from the road. Food and water were limited, and rest came only in short intervals. For most of us, carrying 70 pounds of equipment for miles would be an ordeal in itself. For Spartans, it was simply another day, another chance to prove endurance. When the army stopped for the evening, a camp was set up with the same discipline that marked every other part of life. Tents were arranged in order, watch posts established, fires lit for cooking. Meals on campaign were even plainer than at home. Bread, cheese, olives, dried meat if available. Black broth might be prepared, though often in smaller portions than in the Syssitia. Hunger was accepted as natural, a reminder that warriors were not meant to live in comfort. Rituals often followed the evening meal. Sacrifices might be offered again, this time to ask for protection through the night. Songs were sung, not idle ballads, but military chants that reinforced unity and courage. Music in Sparta always had a purpose. And even in camp, it reminded the warriors of their discipline and their shared bond. The nights were restless. Warriors slept in shifts, always aware that the enemy might strike. The sound of boots in the dark, the crackle of fire, the low murmur of men speaking in hushed tones, these were the rhythms of a Spartan night on campaign. Rest came lightly, for vigilance was constant. At dawn, the rituals began again. Sacrifices, prayers, and the reading of signs prepared the army for the day ahead. If battle was imminent, Spartans approached it with calm rather than frenzy. Their discipline meant that even on the edge of combat, there was no chaos. They polished their shields, checked their weapons, and formed ranks with the same measured silence that marked their marches. Before fighting began, sacrifices were once more offered to the gods, especially to Ares and to Zeus. Priests walked among the ranks, sprinkling holy water, offering blessings. The warriors stood still, silent behind their shields, their crimson cloaks draped across their shoulders. Only when the omens were declared favorable would the order be given to advance. In these moments before battle, the camp transformed into the phalanx. Warriors closed ranks, lifted their shields, and listened for the music of the pipes. The rhythm steadied them as they moved forward, step by step, into the clash of war. What had been drills and routines in the fields of Sparta now became reality on foreign soil. Not every day of campaign ended in battle. Sometimes weeks passed in marshes, in setting and breaking camp, in waiting for the right moment. Boredom and fatigue could weigh heavily, but Spartans endured it as they endured everything, with silence and discipline. For them, the waiting was simply another test, another trial of patience and strength. And when the campaign was over, whether victorious or defeated, The return home was marked by the same rituals. Sacrifices of thanks were offered, fallen comrades were honored, and the warriors marched back into their city in formation, their shields still gleaming, their discipline unbroken. To imagine a day on campaign as a Spartan is to imagine a life without pause. From the first light of dawn to the last ember of the evening fire, every action was ordered, every moment guided by discipline. There was no wandering, no idle chatter, no relaxation as we know it. The march was steady, the meals were plain, the camp was orderly, the rituals constant. Even away from their city, Spartans carried Sparta with them, in their discipline, their faith, and their unity. For most of us, such a life would be exhausting. The weight of armor, the endless marching, the hunger, the lack of comfort, these alone would be hard to bear. But the greater burden was the constant demand for discipline, the unyielding structure that left no space for personal freedom. On campaign, as at home, the Spartan belonged not to himself, but to the state, to his comrades, to the code that defined him. And yet, this was the source of their strength. It was why enemies feared them, why allies respected them, and why their name still echoes through history. A Spartan on campaign was not an individual soldier. He was part of something larger, a living piece of the phalanx, a warrior bound by duty, carrying the weight of his city wherever he marched. Chapter 13. The Battle of Thermopylae. Among all the moments in Spartan history, one stands above the rest, the Battle of Thermopylae. It has become a story told and retold for centuries, a tale of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of sacrifice that turned defeat into legend. To understand Sparta, one cannot ignore this battle, for it was here that the Spartan code of discipline, endurance, and loyalty was tested to its very limits. The year was 480 BCE, and the Persian king Xerxes had brought an enormous army into Greece. Accounts of its size vary wildly, some claiming hundreds of thousands, others perhaps fewer, but to the Greeks it seemed unstoppable. City after city prepared for war, and alliances formed to resist the invasion. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the hot gates, where mountains pressed close against the sea, the Greeks chose to make their stand. It was here that King Leonidas of Sparta led his small force of warriors. With him were 300 Spartans, handpicked from among the best of the best. They were not alone. Several thousand other Greeks joined the defense. But it is the Spartans who are remembered, for they embodied the unyielding discipline of their city. The choice of Thermopylae was strategic. The pass was narrow, so narrow that only a few men could fight abreast. The Persian advantage in numbers was blunted here, for they could not bring their full force to bear at once. The Greeks formed their phalanx, shields locked, spears leveled, and waited for the tide of Persia to break against them. Day after day, the Persians attacked. Waves of soldiers crashed against the Greek line, but the Spartans held firm. Their discipline, their training, their unity, all came together in those desperate hours. Spears thrust, shields slammed, and the phalanx did not yield. To the Persians, it must have seemed impossible. How could so few resist so many? Yet this was the essence of the Spartan way, the shield of one protecting the man beside him, the courage of each feeding the courage of all. Herodotus, the historian, tells us of the precision with which the Spartans fought. They feigned retreat, luring enemies forward, and turned suddenly, cutting them down. They fought in shifts, so that men could rest while others held the line. Every trick of discipline and training was used to its fullest. The Persians, despite their numbers, found themselves repelled again and again. The battle was not only of weapons, but of spirit. The sight of Spartans fighting with calm in the face of overwhelming force struck awe into friend and foe alike. They combed their hair before battle, performed rituals, and met death not with panic, with steady resolve. For them, Thermopylae was not merely a fight for survival. It was a stage upon which to demonstrate the code of their lives. But the Persians were relentless, and eventually betrayal sealed the defenders' fate. A local Greek revealed to Xerxes a hidden path through the mountains, a way to outflank the Greek position. Leonidas, realizing the trap, dismissed most of the allied troops, allowing them to retreat and fight another day. He remained with his 300 Spartans, along with a small band of allies who chose to stay. Together, they prepared for the end. On the final day, the Persians surrounded the Greeks. Spears shattered, swords dulled, but still the Spartans fought. They held their ground until the last, retreating finally to a small hill where they made their stand. Surrounded, outnumbered, and doomed, they fought to the death. Arrows rained down, and the last defenders fell, their bodies forming a wall as unyielding as their shields had been. Thermopylae was, in a practical sense, a defeat. The Persians marched on, burning Athens and threatening all of Greece. Yet the sacrifice of Leonidas and his men became something greater than victory. Their stand inspired the Greeks, showing that courage and discipline could resist even the mightiest of foes. Months later, at the battles of Salamis and Plataea, the Persians were finally driven back. Thermopylae, though lost, had given Greece the time and the spirit to fight on. The legacy of Thermopylae endured long after the war. A monument was raised on the battlefield, bearing the words, "Stranger, tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here, obedient to their laws." The message captured the essence of Sparta. These men had not died in vain. They had died in obedience to their code, their city, their way of life. Imagine standing in that narrow pass, shield pressed to your arm, spear in hand, the enemy stretching endlessly before you. Each thrust of your weapon is met with another foe, each moment of survival another test. Behind you, there is no retreat. Beside you, your comrades stand firm, their shields overlapping yours, their courage feeding yours. You know you will not see another dawn, and yet you fight on, because discipline, honor, and duty demand it. For most of us, such a choice would be unthinkable. To march knowingly into death, to fight against impossible odds without hope of survival, is beyond what we could endure. Yet for the Spartans, this was not madness. It was fulfillment. Thermopylae was the ultimate expression of their values, the perfect demonstration of why they trained, endured, and sacrificed every day of their lives. And so, though the Persians won the field, history remembers the Spartans. Their names became a byword for courage, their stand a symbol of resistance. Thermopylae showed the world what discipline could achieve, even in the face of overwhelming force. It remains one of the clearest answers to the question, why would you not last a day as a Spartan? Because for them, even death itself was not an escape from duty. Chapter 14. Why Sparta Feared Change. The story of Sparta is often told in terms of strength, the warriors, the battles, the discipline that made them legendary. But beneath this strength was a deep and constant fear, the fear of change. For all their courage on the battlefield, the Spartans were wary of anything that might disturb the rigid system that defined their lives. To understand why they clung so fiercely to tradition, we must look at what change meant for a society built on discipline and control. Sparta was unlike other Greek city-states. Athens thrived on innovation, welcoming new ideas in philosophy, art, and politics. Corinth built wealth through trade, while other cities experimented with governments, alliances, and cultural exchange. Sparta, by contrast, turned inward. Its leaders believed that stability came not from change, but from resisting it. Every custom, every law, every ritual was carefully guarded, passed down unchanged from one generation to the next. At the heart of this resistance was the Spartan constitution, attributed to the semi-legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. According to tradition, Lycurgus had designed the entire system of Sparta, the agoge, the syssitia, the balance of kings, elders, and citizens. and the Spartans swore never to alter his laws. This oath bound them to a rigid structure, one that valued discipline and uniformity over personal freedom. Why such resistance to change? The answer lay partly in fear of the Helots. The enslaved population outnumbered the Spartans many times over. Any sign of weakness, division, or disorder could spark rebellion. To keep control, the Spartans believed they had to present a united, unchanging front. Discipline was not only for war abroad, but for survival at home. If the system cracked, the foundation of Sparta itself could collapse. Another reason was their distrust of wealth and luxury. Many Greek cities grew rich from trade, building beautiful homes, lavish temples, and fine works of art. Sparta, however, feared that wealth would soften its warriors. Luxury was seen as poison, a slow erosion of the values of endurance and simplicity. Gold and silver coins were banned, replaced with heavy iron bars that discouraged accumulation. Foreign merchants and travelers were viewed with suspicion, their influence carefully limited. The Spartans guarded their society like a fortress, fearing that foreign ideas might weaken the discipline that kept them strong. Even in politics, change was resisted. Sparta's unusual system of dual kingship, combined with a council of elders and an assembly of citizens, remained remarkably stable for centuries. While other states experimented with democracy, tyranny, or oligarchy, Sparta clung to its balance of power. The kings led in war. The elders advised, the assembly affirmed decisions, and together, this rigid system resisted the tides of innovation. To outsiders, it seemed inflexible. To Spartans, it was the anchor that kept their society steady. This fear of change shaped even their approach to culture. Unlike Athens, Sparta did not encourage philosophy, theater, or artistic exploration. Music, poetry, and dance existed, but they were bound to military or religious purposes. Every aspect of culture was measured by its usefulness to the state. Beauty for beauty's sake was considered wasteful, even dangerous. To allow art or philosophy to flourish freely might encourage questioning of the system, and questioning was a form of change. Imagine living in such a society. Every day, the same routines. Every year, the same rituals. Customs unchanged for generations, each one defended fiercely against the possibility of alteration. For most of us, such rigidity would feel stifling. We look for novelty, we welcome variety, we thrive on growth and experimentation. But in Sparta, stability was valued above all. Change was not opportunity. It was threat. The irony is that this fear of change was both Sparta's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It allowed them to create a society of unmatched discipline, producing warriors who could stand against overwhelming odds. But it also left them brittle. When new challenges arose, economic shifts, changing alliances, innovations in warfare, Sparta was slow to adapt. Their very strength became a chain, binding them to old ways even as the world around them evolved. This fear also explains much about why the Spartans seemed so severe to outsiders. To Athenians, who delighted in debate and discovery, Spartan rigidity seemed almost barbaric. To traders and travelers, their suspicion of foreigners seemed hostile. Yet for the Spartans, these were necessary walls, defenses against the slow creep of change that might undo everything they had built. Even in death, their fear of change showed itself. Tombstones for Spartan men recorded only one thing: if the man had died in battle. For women, only if she had died in childbirth. No other achievements mattered. No other words were carved. To record wealth, talent, or beauty would have suggested individuality, a shift away from the collective values of the state. In this way, even memory was disciplined, guarded against change. The fear of change reveals another truth about Sparta, that their endurance, though legendary, was fragile. It created a system that depended on everything remaining exactly as it was. The Helots subdued, the warriors disciplined, the traditions unbroken. For centuries it worked, but history is never still. Eventually, the world changed, and Sparta's refusal to adapt left it vulnerable. For us today, the Spartan fear of change feels distant. We live in a world where change is constant, where innovation drives progress, where flexibility is a strength. But for the Spartans, survival meant holding fast, resisting every tide, standing firm like their phalanx on the battlefield. In their eyes, change was not growth. Change was defeat. And so, the same discipline that made Sparta great also sealed its fate. Their strength lay in their ability to resist, to endure unchanged. Their weakness lay in the fact that nothing in this world endures forever. Chapter 15. What made Sparta different from other Greeks? To fully understand Sparta, we must step back and see it not just in isolation, but in contrast with the rest of Greece. The Greek world was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own character, values, and way of life. Athens loved debate and ideas. Corinth thrived on trade and wealth. Thebes grew strong in agriculture and military innovation. Yet among them all, Sparta stood apart. A world so different that even other Greeks regarded it with a mixture of awe, fear, and puzzlement. One of the clearest differences was in government. Athens is remembered for its democracy, where citizens debated laws, argued in the assembly, and voted on decisions. The Athenian system celebrated persuasion and rhetoric, giving individuals a voice in the life of the city. Sparta, on the other hand, valued silence and obedience. Their government was a blend of monarchy, oligarchy, and limited democracy. Two kings ruled simultaneously, primarily as military leaders. A council of elders, the Gerousia, held much of the real power, shaping laws and decisions. The citizen assembly existed, but its role was modest. Spartans voted by shouting, and their voices merely affirmed what the elders proposed. The contrast was striking. Athens celebrated the noise of democracy, while Sparta valued the quiet of discipline. Culture was another dividing line. Athens overflowed with art, theater, and philosophy. Plays were performed in grand theaters, philosophers debated beneath colonnades, and painters and sculptors created works that celebrated beauty. Sparta deliberately turned away from such pursuits. They had music, but it was martial. They had poetry, but it praised courage and discipline. Art, if it existed, served the state. The Athenians built the Parthenon. The Spartans built barracks. To other Greeks, this seemed austere, even bleak. To Spartans, it was strength. Education reflected this divide. A boy in Athens might study philosophy, mathematics, or rhetoric, preparing for a life of public debate. A boy in Sparta was sent to the agoge, where he learned to endure hunger, pain, and hardship. The mind of an Athenian was trained to argue. The body of a Spartan was trained to fight. Neither system was complete in itself, but each reflected what the city valued most. The role of women was perhaps the most shocking difference. In Athens, women lived largely in seclusion, excluded from politics, denied formal education, and bound to the home. In Sparta, women trained their bodies, spoke their minds, and managed estates. They walked in public with confidence, their independence startling to outsiders. While Athenians mocked Spartan women as bold and unseemly, Spartans admired them as vital to the survival of their city. The contrast was so sharp that Greek writers often used Spartan women as examples in debates about the proper role of women in society. Sparta also differed in its relationship to wealth. Greek cities like Corinth thrived on trade, filling their markets with goods from across the Mediterranean. Sparta distrusted commerce. Gold and silver were banned, replaced by iron bars so bulky and heavy that trade became impractical. Foreign merchants were discouraged, and travel was limited. While other Greeks grew rich, Spartans prided themselves on austerity. To live simply, to avoid luxury, was seen as a mark of strength. Wealth, in their eyes, softened the spirit and corrupted discipline. Religion, too, took on a distinctive tone. All Greeks honored the gods, but Sparta emphasized rituals that reinforced unity and endurance. The famous festival of Artemis Orthia, with its harsh rites of endurance, reflected their belief in discipline above comfort. Festivals in Athens might celebrate theater or art. Festivals in Sparta tested the courage of youths with ritual whippings and trials of pain. The divine for Spartans was always tied to strength. Even warfare itself highlighted the differences. Greek armies were often composed of citizen soldiers, men who trained part-time but spent much of their lives in other pursuits. For Spartans, war was life. From the agoge to the phalanx, every aspect of their existence revolved around battle. To face an Athenian army was to face men of many trades: farmers, potters, merchants, sailors. To face a Spartan army was to face men who had done nothing but trained for war since childhood. This difference was stark, and it gave the Spartans a reputation that stretched across Greece and beyond. Yet perhaps the greatest difference lay in how Sparta defined freedom. For Athenians, freedom meant the right to speak, to vote, to shape the life of the city through debate and persuasion. For Spartans, freedom meant the absence of weakness, the ability to endure without bending, the security of a system where every man knew his place. Their freedom was collective, not individual. It was the freedom of the phalanx, not one man standing alone, but all standing together. To imagine the differences more vividly, picture yourself walking through Athens. The streets bustle with merchants and craftsmen. Philosophers debate in the agora. Artists carve marble, and playwrights rehearse lines for the theater. Now imagine walking through Sparta. The streets are quieter, more orderly. Barracks dominate the landscape. Boys run barefoot in the dust, practicing drills. Women move confidently, managing homes and lands. Conversation is brief, sharp, and practical. Where Athens hums with energy and ideas, Sparta resonates with silence and discipline. These differences often led to tension between the two cities. Athens accused Sparta of being harsh, unimaginative, even cruel. Sparta accused Athens of being soft, decadent, and undisciplined. When they allied against Persia, their differences were set aside for survival. But soon after, in the Peloponnesian War, their contrasts turned into conflict, a struggle not only of armies but of values. Athens fought for empire and influence. Sparta fought to preserve its austere way of life. Sparta's uniqueness was both its strength and its weakness. It gave them warriors who could stand at Thermopylae, men who valued honor over life itself. But it also isolated them, cutting them off from the innovations and exchanges that enriched the rest of Greece. In clinging to their differences, they ensured their legacy, but also their eventual decline. For us today, the contrast between Sparta and other Greeks reminds us of how varied human societies can be. Two cities, only days apart by sea, could build entirely different worlds, one devoted to ideas, the other to endurance. One celebrating beauty, the other scorning it. One shaping democracy, the other shaping warriors. Both left legacies that echo still, each a reflection of what they valued most. And so, when we look at Sparta, we see not just a city of warriors, but a city defined by difference. Difference that made it feared, admired, and ultimately remembered. Chapter 16. Cracks in the Spartan system. For centuries, Sparta appeared unshakable. Its warriors stood firm on the battlefield, its society remained rigidly disciplined, and its reputation spread far beyond Greece. Yet beneath the surface of this iron discipline, cracks began to appear. No society, no matter how strong, is immune to change, and the very system that made Sparta formidable also carried the seeds of its decline. One of the greatest weaknesses was numbers. The Spartan way of life demanded that only a select class of men could become full citizens, the Spartiates. These were the warriors who trained in the agoge, ate in the mess halls, and formed the phalanx. But this group was always small, and over time it grew smaller still. War, disease, and natural disasters all took their toll. A devastating earthquake in the mid-5th century BCE killed many citizens, further reducing their numbers. Every death was not only a personal loss, but also a blow to the strength of the phalanx. At the same time, the requirements of Spartan citizenship were strict. To remain a Spartiate, a man had to contribute monthly to his mess hall. If he failed, whether through poverty or misfortune, he could lose his status. Some men, unable to meet these obligations, slipped into lower classes, reducing the pool of full citizens even further. By the later centuries, Sparta, once famed for its warrior numbers, had dwindled to only a fraction of its former strength. The mighty wall of shields grew thinner. The Helots remained another source of instability. Though subdued for generations, they never ceased to be a threat. Their numbers far exceeded those of the Spartans, and rebellions flared whenever opportunity arose. The great revolt after the earthquake showed just how fragile Spartan control could be. Keeping the Helots in check required constant vigilance, trolls, and intimidation. Every Spartan lived with the knowledge that his society balanced on a knife's edge, that the laborers who fed them might rise against them at any time. Wealth, too, became a problem. Though Sparta had long resisted luxury, cracks appeared here as well. Victories in war brought spoils, and as Sparta grew more involved in Greek politics, especially after defeating Athens in the Peloponnesian War, wealth began to seep into the city. Gold and silver, once banned, found their way into Spartan hands. Some families grew richer than others, creating inequality that their rigid system had long tried to prevent. With wealth came corruption, and with corruption came the slow erosion of discipline. Another crack was isolation. Sparta had deliberately turned away from trade, art, and cultural exchange, focusing instead on discipline and war. For a time, this worked, but as the Greek world evolved, Sparta found itself left behind. While Athens flourished in philosophy and science, producing ideas that would influence the world for millennia, Sparta clung to its old ways. What once made them strong eventually made them brittle. A society that refused to adapt struggled to survive when the world around it changed. Even in war, their dominance was not eternal. At Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Thebans under Epaminondas shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. Using new tactics, the Thebans broke the Spartan phalanx and killed hundreds of warriors, including many from Sparta's elite. It was a blow from which the city never fully recovered. For centuries, Sparta had been feared as unbeatable. In a single day, that illusion was broken. The decline in citizen numbers was especially striking. Where once thousands of Spartiates had stood ready for war, by the later years only a few hundred remained. Without men to fill the ranks, the phalanx could no longer dominate. Sparta's power withered, and though it lingered as a city, its days as a great power were gone. And yet, even as these cracks widened, the Spartans clung fiercely to their traditions. They resisted reform, resisted innovation, resisted any attempt to broaden their citizenship or change their system. Some leaders tried to adjust, but they faced fierce opposition. To change was to betray Lycurgus, to abandon the very code that had made them strong. In this way, their greatest strength, discipline, became their greatest weakness. It bound them so tightly to the past that they could not step into the future. Imagine living in Sparta during these years of decline. You would still hear the morning drills, still see the young boys in the agoge, still sit in the syssitia and eat your black broth. Outwardly, life would appear unchanged. But beneath the surface, whispers of worry would grow. Fewer men in the ranks, fewer shields in the phalanx, helots restless in the fields, wealth beginning to divide the community. The rituals continued, the discipline remained, but the foundation was weakening. For most of us, it is difficult to imagine a society so strong beginning to unravel not from outside invasion, but from within. Yet this is the story of Sparta. Its rigid system, designed to endure forever, could not withstand the slow erosion of numbers, wealth, and change. The cracks were not sudden. They spread over generations, widening until the structure that had seemed unbreakable began to collapse. The fall of Sparta was not a single event, but a long fading. And yet, even in decline, the image of Sparta endured. Other Greeks might mock their poverty or point to their shrinking numbers, but they still remembered Thermopylae, the phalanx, the code of discipline. Sparta's body may have weakened, but its spirit lingered, etched into history. And so, the cracks in the Spartan system remind us of a truth that applies far beyond their time, that no society, however disciplined, can remain unchanged forever. Strength can become rigidity. Stability can become fragility. What makes a people great in one age may hold them back in the next. Chapter 17. The Fall of Sparta. For centuries, Sparta had stood as a symbol of strength, a city that seemed unbreakable. Its warriors feared across Greece, its system admired and dreaded in equal measure. But no power lasts forever. The same discipline that had made Sparta great also limited its ability to change, and slowly the city that once dominated Greece began to fade. The fall of Sparta was not a single dramatic collapse, but a long decline marked by battles lost, numbers dwindling, and traditions eroding. The turning point came in 371 BCE at the Battle of Leuctra. For generations, Spartans had believed their phalanx to be invincible. Other Greek cities had feared to face them in open battle. But at Leuctra, Thebes, under the brilliant general Epaminondas, shattered that illusion. By concentrating his forces on one wing, Epaminondas broke through the Spartan line, killing hundreds of warriors, including many of Sparta's elite. It was a staggering blow. The myth of Spartan invincibility, built over centuries, was undone in a single day. The loss at Leuctra was more than a military defeat. It was a blow to Sparta's very identity. The phalanx, the symbol of their discipline, had failed. Their enemies had learned that Spartans could be beaten, and with that knowledge, fear of them began to fade. For a society built on the reputation of its warriors, this was devastating. In the years that followed, Sparta struggled to recover. Thebes invaded the Peloponnese, liberating Messenia, the fertile land that Sparta had long controlled through the labor of the Helots. With the loss of Messenia came the loss of a vital foundation. For centuries, Helot labor had sustained Spartan warriors, providing food so they could devote themselves to training. Without that labor, the system faltered. Sparta's strength had rested on the backs of others, and when those backs were freed, the warrior state began to crumble. The number of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, dwindled further. Wars, disasters, and the strict rules of citizenship had already reduced their numbers. And now the losses of Leuctra and the liberation of the Helots deepened the decline. By some accounts, within a few generations, only a few hundred true citizens remained. The proud phalanx, once filled with thousands of shields, was reduced to a shadow of itself. Wealth, once despised, began to seep into the cracks. As Sparta weakened, some families grew rich, creating divisions that their rigid system could not contain. The equality that had once bound Spartan warriors together eroded. Discipline waned, luxury crept in, and with it came corruption. The very things Sparta had long feared began to take root, not from outside influence, but from within. Politically, too, Sparta lost its place. Where once it had led alliances, now it followed or stood aside. Athens recovered, Thebes rose, and later, Macedon under Philip and Alexander overshadowed them all. Sparta, once the terror of Greece, became a city remembered more for what it had been than for what it was. Yet even in decline, the Spartans clung to their traditions. They continued the agoge, the syestia, the rituals of discipline. Outwardly, life went on as before. Boys trained, warriors marched, elders ruled. But beneath the surface, the city no longer commanded fear or respect. Its enemies no longer trembled at its name, and its allies no longer looked to it for leadership. The final blow came with Rome. By the time the Romans expanded into Greece, Sparta was no longer a power, but a curiosity. Tourists from other lands came to see the place once famed for its warriors, to watch ritual flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia, to marvel at a city that had clung so stubbornly to its past, even as the world around it moved on. Sparta became less a living power than a symbol, a reminder of a way of life that had already faded. Imagine walking through Sparta in those later years. The barracks still stand, boys still run barefoot through the dust, and crimson cloaks still hang on the shoulders of men. But the numbers are smaller, the pride dimmed, the glory remembered more than lived. The Helots are gone, the lands of Messenia lost, and the phalanx no longer dominates the battlefield. The silence that once spoke of discipline now carries an echo of decline. And yet, the fall of Sparta was not an erasure. Though the city shrank into obscurity, its story lived on. Other Greeks, Romans, and later historians retold the tales of Thermopylae, of discipline, of mothers sending sons to battle with words of courage. Sparta became more powerful in memory than it had been in its final days. Its decline did not erase its legend. It transformed it. For us today, the fall of Sparta is a reminder that no system, however strong, can resist change forever. A society built on discipline and fear may endure for centuries. But when its foundations shift, when numbers dwindle, when wealth corrupts, when enemies learn new ways, even the strongest walls crumble. Sparta's greatness was real, but so too was its fragility. And so, the story of the fall is not just about loss, but about transformation. Sparta, the city that once dominated Greece, became instead a symbol, a lesson, a legend. Its warriors may have faded, but their memory endured, carried through history as a reminder of both the power and the limits of discipline. Chapter 18. Could you survive as a Spartan? After walking through the story of Sparta, from the birth of its children to the discipline of the agoge, from the bonds of the Syssitia to the courage at Thermopylae, from the quiet strength of its women to the long decline of its power, a question lingers. Could you survive as a Spartan? At first, the idea may seem tempting. To imagine yourself in the crimson cloak, shield in hand, standing shoulder to shoulder with comrades, facing the enemy with unflinching courage, it has an undeniable appeal. The legends of Sparta inspire visions of bravery, of strength, of living a life of purpose. But the reality was far harsher than the legends suggest. To survive as a Spartan, you would first need to survive birth itself. The elders would inspect you, and only if you seemed strong and healthy would you be allowed to live. From your first days, your life would not belong to you, but to the state. Your childhood would not be filled with toys or indulgence, but with trials. Cold baths, plain food, and stern discipline would shape your early years. At the age of 7, you would leave your family and enter the agoge, where the true test began. There, hunger would follow you daily. You would be given little food, encouraged to steal, but punished if caught. You would sleep on reed beds, train barefoot, and endure beatings meant to harden your spirit. Silence would be demanded, endurance expected. Could you hold back your tears? Could you keep your voice steady while hunger gnawed at your stomach? Most of us today would falter within days. By 20, your life would not grow easier. You would live in the barracks, not at home, bound to the mess hall and your comrades. Your meals would still be plain, your life still ruled by discipline. Marriage might come, but it would be lived in secrecy and absence. Your loyalty demanded more by the state than by your family. Each day would be filled with training, patrols, and preparation for war. Your body would be weighed down by bronze armor, your arm pressed sore by the weight of the shield. To hold that shield was not optional. It was your life and the life of the man beside you. To drop it was the greatest shame. Could you carry 70 pounds of armor for hours, march miles beneath the sun, and then fight without rest? Could you thrust your spear again and again, never breaking formation, never faltering in rhythm? Even more than strength, you would need obedience. The Spartan code demanded that you follow orders without hesitation. To pause, to question, to disobey could bring ruin not only on yourself, but on your unit. Could you surrender your individuality so completely that your life became only a piece of the phalanx, your shield protecting your comrade's shield protecting you? And what of fear? A Spartan was not allowed to fear death. To retreat, to flee, to show cowardice was worse than dying. Could you walk into a battle knowing you would not return, yet still stand firm, still raise your shield, still thrust your spear, calm in the face of certain doom? For most of us, fear would overwhelm. But for Spartans, fear of shame outweighed fear of death. Even at home, you would not escape the demands of the state. Wealth was limited, luxury frowned upon, comfort discouraged. Your meals would remain simple, your possessions plain. Could you live without indulgence, without variety, without the small pleasures that make life easier? Could you accept a life stripped to its bare essentials, every moment shaped by discipline? And what of family? Could you send your son to the agoge at the age of 7, knowing the hardships he would endure, knowing he might not survive? Could you, as a mother, hand him his shield and tell him to return with it or on it? Could you, as a father, accept that your son no longer belonged to you, but to Sparta? To survive as a Spartan was not only to survive hunger, pain, and battle. It was to survive a life in which the self was always secondary, where every breath, every step, every act served the state. It was to live with constant vigilance, constant restraint, constant awareness that you were never your own master. Most of us would not last a day. We might stumble under the weight of armor, falter in the silence of discipline, or collapse under the hunger of the agoge. We might seek comfort, crave freedom, or long for individuality. The very things that make life sweet to us, choice, indulgence, expression, were the very things Spartans feared. And yet, there is something in their story that still inspires. Though their world was harsh, their endurance was real. Though their system was rigid, their courage was undeniable. Though their decline was inevitable, their legacy remains. We remember them not for their comforts, but for their sacrifices. Not for their wealth, but for their discipline. Not for their freedom as individuals, but for their unity as a people. So could you survive as a Spartan? Perhaps not. But you can carry something of their spirit, the reminder that endurance is possible, that discipline has strength, and that sometimes unity can achieve what seems impossible. The Spartans lived in a way few of us could endure, but in their story, we glimpse what human beings are capable of when pushed to their limits. And now, as our journey through Sparta draws to a close, let your thoughts drift gently from the clash of spears and shields to the quiet of your own rest. The discipline of Sparta was theirs, but peace, comfort, and sleep are yours. Before you drift off completely, I'll remind you once more. If you've enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps our small community grow, and it ensures you can return whenever you need a calm story to carry you into rest. In the comments, let us know what parts of history you'd like to hear next, and when and where you usually listen in, whether it's at bedtime, during a nap, or simply when you need to escape the day. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the story of Sparta fade into the distance, like the echo of shields on a battlefield long gone. May their discipline give you peace, and may their silence guide you into sleep. And so, Our journey through the world of Sparta comes to an end. We have walked from the cradle of a Spartan child to the discipline of the agoge, from the weight of bronze armor to the silence of the phalanx, from the proud voices of Spartan women to the fading echoes of their final decline. In every step, we have seen why you and most of us today would not last a single day as a Spartan warrior. Their world was one of hardship and discipline, sacrifice and silence, honor and fear. It was a way of life that forged legends, but also carried immense burdens. The Spartans remind us that human beings can endure far more than we imagine, but also that such endurance comes at a cost. For them, freedom meant obedience, strength meant suffering, and greatness meant giving up the self for the whole. For us, their story is both awe-inspiring and sobering, a glimpse into a world so different from our own that it feels almost like a dream. As you let these thoughts settle, allow your mind to quiet. The clang of bronze, the echo of marching feet, the whispers of Spartan mothers, let them fade into the distance, leaving only calm and rest. The story has been told. The warriors have returned to the earth. Now the silence belongs to you. Before you drift into sleep, I'll remind you once more, if you've enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps our little community grow and ensures you'll always have a calm story waiting when you need it most. And in the comments, share what parts of history interest you. And when you like to listen in, whether before bed, during the quiet of an afternoon, or whenever you need a gentle voice to carry you away. Thank you for joining me tonight. May the discipline of Sparta give you perspective, and may the quiet of history guide you into peaceful dreams. Good night.